If you ask most people what makes retirement safer, they will usually give you an answer that sounds like addition. Save more, buy more, accumulate more, protect more, delay a little longer, and gather a little more. That advice is not always wrong. I spent most of my life understanding the power of accumulation. I know what a retained dollar can become when it is treated correctly over time. I have made a career out of believing that productive assets, patience, and rational capital allocation can turn modest beginnings into extraordinary outcomes. But there is another truth that many people do not appreciate until they are standing at the edge of retirement. The next stage of life is not improved only by adding. Very often it is improved by subtraction. That is the part most people miss. They enter retirement still thinking like collectors. They ask, what else should I keep? What else should I insure? What else should I preserve? What else should I carry with me? They do not ask a much more important question: what has become too expensive to continue carrying? I do not mean expensive only in dollars. I mean expensive in time, expensive in maintenance, expensive in attention, expensive in identity, expensive in the number of, and that last cost is the one people most consistently underestimate. Money is precious in retirement. Time is more precious. Energy is more precious. Freedom from needless obligation is more precious. By the time a person reaches retirement, the game changes in your working years. It often made sense to carry more weight because that weight was in service of something. A larger house made sense because children filled it. 2 or 3 cars made sense because schedules collided. Certain possessions made sense because they reflected the life you were actively living. A professional identity made sense because your work structured your days, your conversations, your confidence, and the way the world greeted you. Then one day the structure changes. The children leave, the commute disappears, the calendars open. The job title falls away. The objects remain. And many people keep paying for an old life while trying to begin a new one. That is a subtle but expensive mistake. I want to tell you something I have observed over and over. There are retirees who technically have enough money and still do not experience much freedom. There are others with less money who seem to move through retirement with more ease, more peace, more room to enjoy themselves, and more gratitude. The difference is often not that one group invested brilliantly while the other did not. The difference is that one group simplified intelligently. They stopped carrying what no longer served them. That is what I want to talk about. Not because I am interested in deprivation. I am not. Retirement is not a punishment for having worked hard. It is not a contest to see how little you can live on. It is a period that should be shaped to fit the life you actually want, not the life you once needed. That requires honesty. It requires emotional maturity, and it often requires selling or releasing things that once felt essential. The first is the oversized house. This is the most obvious one financially, which is one reason so many people resist it emotionally. A house is almost never just a house. It is memory, it is proof, it is the visible shape of a family story. Children came home there from school, holidays happened there, arguments happened there, recoveries happened there. It held growth, noise, and responsibility for years. When a house has carried your life for decades, the mind does not experience it as an asset. It experiences it as biography. That is why downsizing is not merely a real estate transaction. It is an identity negotiation. And yet the arithmetic can become impossible to ignore. A house that was right for 5 people can become absurd for 2. The mortgage may be gone, but the costs remain: property taxes, repairs, maintenance, insurance, utilities, yard work, upkeep, endless small decisions. The hidden payroll of home ownership never quite stops, even when the children are long gone and the rooms stand quietly unused. I knew a couple who had raised a large family in a beautiful home. It was the sort of place that made sense, when every bedroom carried a life and every weekend involved activity. By the time they came to retirement, the home was mostly hallways and memory. They insisted, at first, that they loved the house too much to leave it. So I asked a different question. Do you love the house, or do you love what the house wants? That question changed everything. When we pulled it apart carefully, they realized something revealing. They did not actually love managing the house. They did not love the bills. They did not love the repairs. They did not love the winters there. They did not love the sense that the house quietly dictated how much energy their lives required. What they loved was the neighborhood, the nearness to people they cared about, the familiarity and the story. Those things can often be preserved without preserving the entire structure. In the end, they moved into a smaller place in the same general area and used the released equity to create more flexibility in retirement. Their annual costs dropped, their stress dropped, their choices increased. They did not become smaller because the house became smaller. That is a lesson people need to hear. A large house can feel like security because it is substantial. Sometimes it is really just responsibility in a handsome costume. I have no problem with someone keeping a large house if it still actively serves the life they are living. But if the house now mostly serves the memory of a life that has ended, then it is no longer simply shelter. It is drag. And drag is expensive in retirement. The second thing many retirees need to stop carrying is financial support for adult children, when that support begins threatening their own stability. This is harder than the house. The house is brick and lumber. Children live in the heart. A parent can often be very rational about a building and almost completely irrational about a child. That is understandable. Love does not become weaker because the child becomes 30, but the economic truth remains what it is. Your adult children often have time. You do not. They can recover from mistakes in ways you no longer can. They can borrow and work and build and correct course over a longer runway. If you are 60 or 65, you are not managing an abstract future. You are managing a finite collection of healthy years. That changes the moral math. A surprising number of parents quietly delay retirement, reduce their own safety, or keep working longer than they should because they are still financing expenses that rightly belong to the adult lives of their children. Down payments, rent supplements, recurring cash infusions, rescue payments for ordinary mistakes, cars, vacations disguised as family obligations, lifestyle shortfalls, and because the instinct feels loving, it is rarely examined with enough discipline. I am not against helping children, far from it. If you are truly wealthy enough to help without injury, help generously and wisely. If a child faces a genuine emergency, compassion matters. If there is a strategic way to support growth without building dependency, that can be beautiful. But many parents are not doing that. They are not helping from surplus. They are helping from guilt, or from habit, or from the inability to tolerate their child's discomfort. That is not always love. Sometimes it is emotional weakness in respectable clothing. A person who sacrifices 3 prime retirement years to make adult life slightly softer for a grown child is making a trade that should be examined very carefully. Those 3 years are not coming back. The child may not even fully understand what was given up. Parents often imagine that the gift is money. The true gift is time, and that is far more expensive. I would rather see parents help with wisdom than with unstructured subsidy. Advice can be generous. Boundaries can be generous. Temporary targeted help can be generous. Permanent financial leakage is often neither generous nor wise. A child who never has to solve his own ordinary economic problems is not always being helped. He may be delayed, he may be protected from the exact disciplines that adulthood requires. And the parent, in the meantime, becomes less secure at the precise stage of life when security should matter more. That is too high a price. The third thing many retirees should consider selling is the collection of expensive toys that once symbolized joy but now quietly function as storage-based obligations. I say this with sympathy. I understand attachment. A boat is not always a boat. An RV is not always an RV. A classic car is not always transportation. They may represent youth, freedom, craftsmanship, dream, escape, or the reward for decades of work. People do not buy these things only for utility. They buy them because these objects often hold a piece of how they once pictured a good life. That is exactly why they become so difficult to evaluate. Honestly, I knew a man who loved restoring beautiful machines. He was patient, exact, proud of work done by hand, and deeply satisfied by bringing something neglected back into dignity. Over decades, he acquired and maintained several pieces that meant a great deal to him. They were marvelous to look at. They drew admiration. They contained memory. He would have told you, with complete sincerity, that they were among the great joys of his life. Then we looked at what they actually required in retirement, storage, insurance, maintenance, registration, transportation, attention, decision-making, and perhaps most revealing of all, very little actual use. What he truly loved was not the burden of owning all of them. He loved the best part of the relationship. The rest had become obligation. Once he admitted that, the correct move became obvious. He kept what mattered most. He let go of what had become redundant. The released capital helped. The lower costs helped. But the bigger gift was subtler. He stopped being a custodian of underused possessions and became an active enjoyer of the few that still genuinely enriched his life. This is one of the deepest principles in retirement. Keeping everything can prevent you from enjoying anything. People think abundance means holding on to every option. Often it means selecting the best and freeing yourself from the rest. The fourth thing many couples should evaluate is whether they still need multiple vehicles. This sounds small compared with houses and large possessions, but that is what makes it dangerous. Smaller leaks are ignored because they do not feel dramatic enough to deserve scrutiny. A second car in retirement can seem harmless. It sits there. It is familiar. It makes life feel prepared. But every car carries a shadow payroll: insurance, maintenance, registration, tires, repairs, depreciation. The invisible tax of ownership continues even when the vehicle spends most of its life parked. When two people are no longer commuting separately every day, the practical need for two vehicles often weakens sharply. Yet habit is powerful. People continue owning as they used to own because they have not paused long enough to re-examine the life structure underneath the ownership. I like practical experiments here. Do not begin with ideology. Begin with reality. Pretend for 2 or 3 months that you are already a one-car household. Not symbolically, actually. See where the friction appears. See whether the inconvenience is occasional or constant. See whether the money being tied up in the second vehicle is delivering enough value to justify its ongoing claims on your budget and attention. Many couples discover something interesting. What felt indispensable was mostly psychological. The second car represented independence more than actual need. Once they test life without it, the numbers begin speaking more clearly. Some households still need 2 vehicles. Fine, some do not. The point is not that one answer is virtuous and the other is foolish. The point is that retirement should not inherit every expense from working life without interrogation. Then there is the fifth thing, and this one may be the hardest of all to release, because it does not sit in a garage or in a bank account. It sits inside the self. It is work identity. I have known people who were fully ready to retire financially, and yet struggled badly once the title fell away. Not because they missed the income, because they missed the importance, the routine, the authority, the introduction, the shape of the day, the reflected respect, the sense that the world knew exactly what role they played. When a person has been called doctor, executive, owner, manager, partner, or some other high significance title for decades, retirement can feel like demotion unless he is very careful. He says, "I used to be someone." What he means is, the world used to mirror back to me a role I understood. Retirement can be disorienting because it asks you to live without that mirror. Some people handle this beautifully. Others panic. They begin trying to recreate the old identity in every possible form. Consulting work they do not really want. Commitments taken on mainly for the feeling of relevance. Volunteer positions chosen not from joy or service, but from the desire to hear the old version of their name spoken again. That is a trap. Your work may have expressed part of who you were. It was never the whole thing. If you cling too tightly to the professional identity, you will miss the discovery that retirement can offer. You will keep trying to be the previous version of yourself instead of allowing a new version to appear. This is not about becoming useless. It is about becoming free enough to ask a new question. Who am I when my value is no longer measured by my professional output? That can be frightening. It can also be one of the richest questions of later life. I knew a highly accomplished man who had carried a very strong public identity for many years. When he stepped away from full-time work, he felt smaller, though nothing material had really diminished. He had money, he had health, he had family. What he lacked was a role that made immediate sense. Once he stopped trying to preserve, something interesting happened. Interests reappeared. Curiosity reappeared. Relationships deepened. He did not become less. He became more difficult to summarize, which is often a sign of a fuller life. Retirement should not be a prolonged audition for your former self. It should be an opening. Now, all of this raises a very practical question. How do you know whether something should actually be sold, released, reduced, or simply restructured? Because not every large house should be sold. Not every parent should stop helping. Not every hobby asset is dead weight. Not every second car is wasteful. Not every continuing professional commitment is unhealthy. What matters is not ideology. What matters is fit. I would use a very simple framework. First, ask whether the thing serves your new life or whether it primarily served your old life. That is the most important question. Did this make deep sense because of the person I was when I was working, raising children, commuting, managing a full household, or proving something to the world? Or does it genuinely enrich the life I am building now? This is not always obvious. Habits persist longer than usefulness. Many people continue carrying objects, commitments, and expenses simply because those things were once rational, and no one ever formally closed the chapter retirement. If lived intelligently, requires chapter awareness. Second, ask what the full cost really is. Most people count direct cash costs and miss the rest. They say the car cost is fine. But what about the mental space, the upkeep decisions, the storage burden, the opportunity cost of the money sitting inside it, the calendar obligations, the way it influences where you live, the way it narrows what feels possible? A possession or commitment can be cheap in monthly cash and still expensive in psychic drag. Likewise, something can be expensive financially and still worth keeping if it genuinely returns joy, function, and alignment with the life you want. The key is to count honestly. Third, ask what becomes possible if you let it go. This is where the mind begins shifting from scarcity to redesign. What could the released money do? What could the released time do? What could the released attention do? What options appear? What kind of travel becomes easier? What kind of living arrangement becomes lighter? What kind of peace becomes available? This question matters because the mind naturally focuses on loss when selling is discussed. It imagines what is being surrendered. It often neglects what is being unlocked. Sometimes the most intelligent sale is not a loss at all. It is a You are converting trapped value into flexible value. You are converting dead weight into usable freedom. You are converting maintenance into margin. Once people see it that way, the emotional difficulty often becomes easier to bear. There is one more practical method I like because it removes theory and forces experience. Test the absence. Before you make the permanent decision, live as though you already made it. If you are considering a second car sale, live like one-car people for a while. If you are considering spending less on adult children, stop the transfers temporarily and see what changes in the family system. If you are considering moving, begin living mentally and operationally as though the move has already occurred. If you are considering selling a vacation property or an expensive recreational asset, Go 60 or 90 days without using it and observe what happens. Do you truly miss it? Or do you mostly miss the idea of yourself as someone who has it? That distinction can save people from years of error. Retirement is often the first period of life in which a person has enough distance to notice that many possessions and commitments were not being held for utility anymore. They were being held for continuity. The mind says, I have always had this, or this is what someone like me owns, or this proves something about the kind of life I built. That emotional continuity can be very expensive. The best retirees I have known are not the ones who kept the most. They are the ones who learned the difference between memory and burden, between identity and display, between joy and upkeep. They are also the ones who understand that simplification is not a retreat. It is a redeployment. Capital, time, and energy are being redeployed toward what matters more. Now that is wisdom. I should say something important here because some people hear arguments like this and take them too far. The goal is not to strip retirement down until nothing remains beautiful. I have no admiration for empty austerity as a performance. There is no prize for dying with the least furniture, the fewest pleasures, or the most minimalist photographable life. The goal is not less for the sake of less. The goal is less of what no longer fits. So there can be more of what does. More travel, perhaps, more visiting, more flexibility, more peace, more health, more margin, more mornings that do not begin with obligation. More room for grandchildren, books, walks, projects, curiosity, or simple ease. People often think optimization sounds cold. In retirement, it can be deeply humane. You are not optimizing for shareholders. You are optimizing for the quality of the years you still get to live. That is a noble project. If I were approaching retirement now, I would not only review my accounts, I would review my life inventory. What do I own that still deserves to be owned? What am I supporting that should now support itself? What am I maintaining that no longer repays the effort? What identity am I defending that retirement is asking me to release? What would happen if I made courageously rational edits? Those are retirement questions. You cannot answer them once and be done forever. Retirement evolves. What served at 62 may not serve at 70. What was joy at one stage may become complication at another. What felt emotionally impossible to sell in the first year may become obviously unnecessary in the fourth. This is normal. The point is not to get everything perfect in one sweep. The point is to keep reality ahead of sentiment. Sentiment has a place. It should not control the balance sheet. I want to end with the deepest truth underneath all of this. Retirement is not won by owning the most. It is won by aligning what you own, what you spend, what you maintain, and what you identify with to the life you actually want. That is why some people enter retirement with great wealth and little peace, while others enter with less wealth and more. Freedom does not come only from asset totals. It comes from reduced friction, reduced obligations, reduced noise, reduced maintenance, reduced ego involvement, reduced carrying cost, and then finally increased clarity. What matters, who matters, where you want to be, how you want to feel, what you no longer need to prove. If you can sell, release, or simplify your way into those answers, you have not lost anything important. You have bought back the right things, time, attention, optionality, lightness, and in retirement, those may be the most valuable assets of all.